Thank you everyone so much for joining. I'd like to begin by acknowledging traditional owners of the country where I'm speaking from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay respect to elders past and present, and to any mob tuning in today. I'll ask that we just take a minute to consider your connection to the country where you're tuning in from and what that means to you. Thank you. All right. I am very excited to be joined today by two very compelling, original authors of fiction. Marina Lau, the author of Gunk Baby, is her latest novel, and Grace Chan, who has a forthcoming novel, as well as a number of pieces of short fiction. Grace, Jamie, welcome. Here we are.
Thank you.
Hi. Glad
Hi,
to be
everyone.
here.
Yeah, thank you.
I thought we'd actually start with the question on everyone's lips. Genre, what is that all about? What is the deal? Specifically, whether you consider yourself a genre author or what it means to you, the idea of genre. Maybe would we start with, does anyone actually want to start? All right, Jamie, what do you think? Do you consider yourself a genre author?
I think that my practice has been built on exploring genre, but I don't think I ever read as though there were genre, if that makes sense. So growing up, I sort of didn't pick up a book and get the memo that this was a genre book. I just have access to a book and read it, if that makes sense. So growing up, approaching books, and also I read through my speech and drama and my speech therapy. So I had access to all this literature that wasn't just in the school library. So I kind of read everything, including poetry and nonfiction. I kind of didn't even think about form or genre in kind of any way. So I feel like for me, yeah, I still kind of talk about genre as a way to reach a piece of writing rather than as a way to frame it, if that makes sense. I use other ways to frame my fiction. Like I like experimenting with form and the margins of how we actually read it, like the medium, rather than experimenting with genre actively, because I've kind of always acknowledged that genre is really fluid, and it's just a marketing tool a lot of the time. So for me, that's kind of my relationship with genre.
And when you say you use genre to reach a place in writing, what do you mean by that?
I guess for me, the first piece the first like little novel that I ever wrote when I was like 13, 14 was a dystopian speculative novel, but I didn't sort of realize that I was writing that, if that makes sense. So I think when I say I use it to reach a place, I kind of use elements of my whole practice rather than try to imitate or emulate something that I've just read, for example. And I try to utilize that mindset rather than try to utilize a specific source of inspiration, of like one inspiration. So it's writing for me has always been like a practice of uncovering things, of learning about what I need to learn or realizing, what I want to learn or what I'm curious about. And so that the same thing is applied there. It's like my personal practice of exploring many different genres, it kind of feeds into the practice today.
Yeah. Grace, what about yourself? Do you see yourself as a genre author?
I think for me, I would say that I do see myself as a genre writer in many ways. I often tell people that I write, mostly science fiction with a bit of fantasy and horror. But I think ultimately the genre of it just comes secondary. It's sort of where I end up when I'm trying to write what I want to write. So I think the first thing for me is often, when I approach a story or try to create something, there's something that I'm trying to grapple with. So it's like an idea or some aspect of figuring out who I am or how I relate to some aspect of the world or how I feel about something that I'm seeing happening around me, or something in the world that's just evoking some strong feeling or thought in me. And I guess when I write, it's really that process of trying to figure out what I actually feel about what is happening around me or who I am or how I relate to stuff around me. And somehow that, more often than not, ends up in a speculative place. Maybe that's just the way my brain is wired. So yeah, I guess it's like it really just starts from that idea, that feeling that I'm trying to capture. And partly because of where my brain goes and where I hypothesize, and partly because to me, speculative fiction is just so fun as well. It gives me such a sense of delight and joy in what I'm writing. So yeah, I think all of that combines to make me, in a way, a genre writer, if you have to put a label on it. But that's kind of where I end up. Yeah.
We totally don't have to, because the interesting thing, we have to put a label on it. I don't, especially when I read your horror fiction, I don't see you as a genre writer. And I think it's interesting. Two books I've read recently, Mariana Enriquez, which was longlisted for the Booker International Prize. It's a book of horror fiction, but it's not marketed like Stephen King. And when I say genre, I feel genre is something, it's cliched, it's hokey, it has sentences about elves or a shot rang out, something cliched essentially. Whereas in the case of both of your work, and certainly your work, Grace, where I feel like you might see yourself more as a genre author, it's interesting. I don't read it as genre. Do you ever feel that genre, is it something that helps you to market your work or place yourself as an author, or is it a hindrance? Because as a reader, I just don't see genre. I just think it's good work.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really big question. I think some of the things that you mentioned, I think when you say genre, sometimes people automatically think of those tropes, those particular tropes that come from maybe quite outdated or old-fashioned presentations of genre fiction. But I think genre fiction nowadays, and the way it's moving, and people who are writing in that speculative sci-fi fantasy horror space are doing so many interesting things with genre fiction. So really discarding with those sort of more constrained, stereotypical ideas of what genre fiction is, and discarding with traditional ideas of form and tropes, and bringing in, breaking down those boundaries of what genre fiction can be. So for me, I think I'm lucky because I get to write in that space where a lot of people who've been writing much longer than I have already started to break down some of those notions, those outdated notions of what genre fiction can look like, and open it up for a lot more voices. So yeah, I think figuring out where my writing fits into the publishing landscape is something that I am still figuring out as well.
Why not call it literary fiction or see it that way, I guess is my question.
In a way I do, I suppose. It's funny because I didn't think of my novel as literary fiction, but when I signed with Affirm Press, they said it is a literary speculative fiction. I was like, "Ooh, okay, there we go." Yeah, so that's
All
sort
the
of what
boxes
it is.
ticked.
Yeah.
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 I mean, I feel a strong sense of Carmen Maria Machado in some of the writing, and I've never seen that marketed as anything other than literary fiction, notwithstanding there is reference to the tropes that Machado uses. And it's funny, actually, that sort of title that Affirm Press have attached of literary speculative fiction, as you say, Jamie, I think it ties into this idea we have when it comes to the practice of writing, that the genre comes afterward, or it's a marketing sort of brand that is just put on after we've gone through the exploratory process.
Yeah.
Speaking of this, yeah.
Yeah,
What was
I think
the question? Yeah, with yourself, Jamie. Well, say what you were going to say, and then I'll just ask the question.
Well, I think it's interesting because a lot of the time, having had my first book come out as something that was marketed as experimental, it's like experimental against what? You know what I mean? Like, and so many people complained it wasn't experimental enough. And I think that's really interesting because it's less about, I mean, obviously publishers have a lot of work to do in terms of the diversity sort of factor, but also we have taught people to read a certain way, and we've taught people to consume a certain way, that when something is not exactly how it's sold, it's like an injustice. And I think I do the same thing when I read a book. But, you know, I kind of, as a writer, I have the luxury of reading it and being like, whoa, this is taking a completely different turn to how I thought. It's not true to the blurb at all. But I think it says a lot more about how we've been conditioned to read by, you know, the previous people that worked in publishing over time and have developed like a canon of literature. And I think that that is something to play with as a writer now as a result. Yeah.
I feel like it's analogous to the idea of a foreign language, because actually I think we all speak other languages, and I think it's funny because a foreign language is only foreign because you don't speak it. In other words, you see yourself as subject and everyone else is wrong, but in fact, in another point of reference, you're the object, you know, you're the foreigner. And as you're saying, Jamie, it's about where you stand and what you're used to in terms of context. I agree with you about the debut being experimental. I mean, experimental compared to what? I think just because it isn't the story of a farmer traumatized by a rabbit shooting incident. It's funny too, because when I reviewed your novel in The Guardian, the editor actually said that my review was too experimental.
Yeah.
Again, experimental compared to what? I think.
Oh no, sorry. I thought you'd.
No, you got no.
Oh no, yeah. I guess it's the same thing.
Yeah.
I think it's the same thing with genre. Like, I think it's like genre compared to what? Like, what are we defining as genre? Are we talking about ghost writing? Because I think that's where the cliche stuff comes in, like where people are like, you know, oh, that's too genre for me. And it's kind of like, well, no, you just haven't sort of read deeply into that genre, because it's like you don't, I don't know, you kind of, if you haven't read outside of literary fiction, which is crazy because I think a lot of what you're taught in a literature degree is like, it doesn't really span outside, or like, I don't know, a lot of things don't get put out. So it's kind of like, if you're already writing off the idea of genre, like, where are you finding that comparative point? Like, what is, you know, what is too genre for you? You know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's always been a question for me, because it's like, if you're someone that enjoys being curious, because, you know, that's what all readers are, they're curious, and that's what all writers should be as well. I just think that it's something that will always benefit your reading, and the way that you think is to read like something that's outside of the genre that you usually read, or especially outside of literary.
Well, let's come to this question of literary. What is literary fiction? What is literature? As opposed to genre or anything else? Because two people have actually asked in the chat, what do we mean by, what is your interpretation of literary fiction, either when you were growing up or in the present day? What about yourself, Greg?
I
curious.
think for me, my not knowing what exactly the definitions are is maybe not an advantage, but maybe it sort of allowed me to just write what I wanted to write in a way. So I think for me, coming to writing from a not knowing very much about the publishing industry until, starting to, have more direct experience with it in the past couple of years and talking to other writers more in the past couple of years, there were a lot of things I didn't know about how writing was marketed and the genre versus literary sort of divide, if you will. So I think the question of what is literary is still a bit, to me, it seems a little bit, I don't know if pointless is the right word in some ways, but it just seems a bit arbitrary and a little bit not that relevant sometimes to what I write. It's like, I think we all often share this feeling of we just want to write what we want to write and and not have a particular label put on it. So I'm really curious to hear what you guys think is literary writing. Yes.
What about yourself?
I have some thoughts, but I'm curious to hear.
Yeah, and what about yourself, Jamie? And also building upon what Grace has said, where as a writer, I think, Grace, you're suggesting you don't think about it. So I'm curious as a writer how you feel, Jamie, and also as a reader, maybe as a reader now or before you had written anything, whether you're aware, what I'm reading now, this is literary or this is not literary.
Yeah, I think for me, I was exactly the same. I wasn't really aware what was literary, except that I knew that if it was literary, it would be critically studied. So it's very exclusive in the academic scene, what you kind of study if you're trying to study literature. And so all I knew was that there was always a critical lens put on it. And that made something literary to me. So even if there was something outside of the literary, what would be classified as literary by a publisher, for example, I'd still see that as literary as long as we were sort of critically studying it and sort of not, I don't know, I guess enjoyment is an interesting place to go with this, because it's there's a lot of things that are called literary and you just don't enjoy it. And it's not got that sort of pure enjoyment. And so for me, again, literary is really just something that someone decides to put on it when it goes to publishing. But also I guess, talking about that critical lens. And I don't know why my books are sold as, I think both of my books are sold as literary fiction, but I think that's just because no one knows what to call it, really. Because I would have called my first book a book of poetry if I kind of had the choice to.
No, it's definitely, there are more and more books actually that are pushing these prose poetry boundaries. I think a lot more poetry is like prose poetry now, a lot more prose is like poetry, and that has been really interesting to see. I think, what do you think, Grace, about this idea of literature as being something you study or junk food? Because that's what I heard you saying, Jamie, is it's the idea, what's good for you is a little bit of work. What is pure enjoyment, that can't really be literary because it's the guilty pleasure idea. It's the idea you can't have too much fun.
Well, that's how people frame it, I think. I think that's how people capitalize off of literature, by sort of separating the two. I don't know. Sorry, Grace, back to you.
No, I was just thinking about what you said as well about literary fiction or literary writing being something that can be studied, but really sort of any sort of writing can be critically examined and critically studied. So I don't know, it's anything. Does that mean anything can be literary?
Well, that's kind of what I meant. It's kind of like what they put on the curriculum, kind of like when you're in high school, right? There's a lot of Australian history that's left out. There's a lot of history around the world that we kind of leave out. It's the way that I feel about literary fiction or literary writing in universities, because I studied in a degree, And I thought that I was getting access to all kinds of literature, but then I sort of realized that it was the standard kind of literature degree that we did. And it did make me question, and it did kind of make me more narrow-minded while I was actually studying what they put on the curriculum, if that makes sense. Like, I'd prefer to critically examine everything that I read. It's a posture that you're taught when you study it, but what you're studying doesn't necessarily make it the only thing available to critically study, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm curious what we studied actually in high school or university, because it sounds like, Jamie, you and myself both studied literature at university. Grace, I'm not sure if you did. If not, I'm guessing at least at high school you
I did the usual things.
Tell me in high school what books or films were assigned.
Oh my gosh. I remember reading Gattaca, Tim Winton, Shakespeare. Yeah.
And what about yourself,
going
Jamie?
back a while.
In high school, university.
I was really, so this is the thing, right? Because I'm talking about like what I studied, but I actually really found it difficult to read what I studied. I'm kind of outing myself a bit.
You don't have to say that you didn't read it. You just have to say, I was supposed to read it.
I thought it was going to be like a Q&A on the book.
No one actually reads Tim Winton. They just say they've read Tim
Putting
Winton.
us on the spot, Declan.
I read Kate Grenville, Year 12. I read The Reluctant Fundamentalist. I'm sorry, I have the worst memory.
But this is really interesting. So I read Fly Away Peter by David Malouf, Shakespeare. The Matrix might have been assigned. I think Gattaca, The Matrix. So this is really interesting, though.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, we all share in common. The books seem to be this kind of Australiana literary fiction genre, like Winton, Grenville, Malouf. Even when those writers are not writing Australiana, the ones that are assigned tend to be the more Australian-centric focused. I'm not sure what Kate Grenville it was. Maybe it was The Secret River, I'm guessing.
The Lieutenant.
Lieutenant. Oh, interesting. Yeah. That's left field. Progressive. But then when it comes to something more speculative or genre, then it becomes the film. So Gattaca or The Matrix. It could be an art house film, notwithstanding ratings. And that's interesting, actually, why that is. Do you feel in writing that it sounds like you both actually take inspiration from various, where you read omnivorously. You're not hemmed in by the idea that you need to read a certain genre or author in order to be a writer. Is that something you both feel that strongly?
Yeah. Or even just like, not even just, this will sound really bad, but I just feel like my whole life, it's sort of been just stories in general, or just like, I'm sure both of you feel the same way. I can see like obviously music and movies and all that. I feel like just reading, and I think that's where we're taught to approach stories a certain way, not even like books, but I think like the way that kind of what I was saying before about like the posture of reading or consuming, and sort of just like critically analyzing anything, like down to like pop music, right? Like critically analyzing pop music, even though it's sort of supposed to be that junk food kind of genre, you can still critically analyze it, and just being taught to approach something a certain way rather than confining yourself to reading one thing to be a genius. Because I feel like those things that people say, you if you're a writer, you have to have read this. I definitely haven't read those things. I don't know about you, Grace.
I know. I've told you haven't read J.G. Ballard. You don't. No one says you have to. That's just me.
I just will not now, just because you've
and I foresaw that. And so I never actually wanted you to read J.G. Ballard. It's okay.
I won't.
I also find it interesting, Jamie, because your work actually is very intertextual. You mention the authors in Gunk Baby that your protagonist has been reading. Grace, your work, I mean, I've mentioned Carmen Maria Machado, or even the Chinese author Pu Songling comes through really strongly, I think, in the worlds you write. But I haven't noticed any sort of intertextual or extratextual references in terms of even music or film or books. So my question is, how do you feel about, in your writing, putting textual references in? Do you think it makes things too tied to the kind of the real world out there? Is it something you purposely avoid? I mean, Jamie, starting with you, having those references in there, I guess what's your intention, or are there any things you worry about in doing that?
I think for me, it's like almost like I started writing. I mean, I'm like sort of talking about this a lot recently, but I automatic write. So for me, it's kind of like credit where credit's due. So like, it's a bit like, I guess it's a bit like autofiction in that way, that the part of my writing that is autobiographical is where I'm learning from and like where I'm getting fed. So, you know, there's a lot of mentions of musicians and films, or in the case of Gunk Baby, film analyses that my character's watching on YouTube. I think those things is like, it's kind of a little Easter egg for myself, but I also feel like I thrived off writing when I was learning about surrealism. And like for a while, I was just writing super surreal things. And, you know, a lot of the writing that I do outside of, you know, the novels that I've written is like really surreal, speculative, kind of like the first like sort of piece I got published was a speculative, surreal piece that was about like the apocalypse. And I think for me, it almost grounds the work, having these real life intertextual references, because it kind of gives a place for us to remind ourselves that at the end of the day, there are so many like contradictions that we take in. So you might be like consuming this work, but you might be consuming this work. And then the contradictions that you're fed from the things that you consume versus the way that you live. And I found that particularly interesting in Gunk Baby. Also Pink Mountain, because Pink Mountain talks about like appropriation and sort of wanting to be an artist for the sake of being an artist and, you know, ripping other artists. And so I think it's just that idea of consuming text, consuming music, consuming film is another way that we contradict how we actually feel and live. And I think that that's a really important factor of our current day living and the generation that's coming up. A lot of what's real for us, you know, in Gen Z is that we, you know, watch certain things and we aspire to that, but then we also live a certain way. And then there's this dream that's sold to us that is created by people in a cloud over here and a cloud over here. And I think that that's really relevant to talk about in an internal world of a character's journey. So for Gunk Baby, talking in that sort of stream of consciousness manner, I thought that was really important to incorporate those references.
It really reminds you of Bret Easton Ellis, where the idea seems to be a person's consumption is their character. It is their personality. I remember in high school knowing a dude who'd listened to Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk on his headphones all the time. And this was like back in the early 2000s. So before it was a meme and before it was associated with things we live with today, like incel culture or men going their own way or men's rights activists and red pilling, black pilling. Yeah, it was like seeing someone's personality at the time that could stand for an entire culture later on. And I think that gets away from the social realist idea that a setting and a sort of typical life and livelihood is what defines your personality and character, when in fact it's more realistic and more socially realist nowadays to look things in the face and say, actually, cultural and pop consumption might say more about you and the world than something outdated, something that tries to avoid those things.
Yeah, true. Or it like sort of drives your decisions a certain way without realizing the context of who you are as a person. So you can be anything you want nowadays. So you go out and you sort of like live a certain way without realizing the weight of you living that way visually, and we're sort of like disembodied. And Gunk Baby is really about bodies, like you're living like this in your head, but your body presents a certain thing and you're normalizing a certain aspect. So I think that's important for my work.
In your work, Grace, I'm not sure actually. I don't think there are many intertextual references. And so I'm curious to ask, first of all, if that's something you ever consider, but also to ask about what does anchor your work, because amidst the tropes that could be read as speculative or fantastical, clearly there's a lot of wonderfully lifelike experience the characters have, especially in terms of race and language comes up in the horror stories in wonderful ways. So tell me a little bit about your relationship between referring to the real world in terms of its culture or in terms of the characterization and their real life problems.
Yeah. As you guys were talking, I was actually thinking a bit about how, and reading your work over the past couple of weeks, I was thinking about how impressed I was with the way you both reference other texts and other aspects of the world around us. I felt that it was a real active response to so many the works of other creators.
Not just geeking out, which is good.
Yeah. and the geeking out about the works of other writers and creators as well. And particularly the way you both incorporate a real sort of, there's a lot of, I think, music and musicality in the way that you both write as well, and other languages interspersed throughout your writing. So I just wanted to geek out about both of your works and say how cool that was to see. In terms of my own writing, I think you are right. I feel that I don't overtly reference many other texts in my work, and perhaps that comes from I think often the way I consume media is very it's a mixture of all kinds of media. So I will read, and that will be driven by whatever I'm interested in, whether it's I don't really like the division of high fiction or low. I don't even know if that's a real division, but I'm just going to read what I want to read or what I find interesting, and that's going to be. I don't think we should be beholden to the classics, or just for the sake of the classics, or any particular text just because of that. And I think, like Jamie, I would consume media from a lot of different forms. So I'm quite a visual person, so things like TV shows, movies definitely leave a lasting impression on me. So I think all of that mashes together, and then I reference things, but in an oblique way, without sort of overtly talking about what I'm referencing. I guess the other big thing that influences my writing is my own sort of background in science, in medicine. So I think a lot about the brain and the mind, and I find the mind incredibly fascinating, which is partly why I work in mental health. And just thinking about the self and how we kind of construct the self and what makes us who we are is a source of endless fascination for me. So that mashes together, I think, with my thoughts about technology. And I particularly like thinking about how technology could affect and change the mind, the brain, enhance, duplicate aspects of the mind, and how that could change our sense of self, our identity, relationships with other people, society. So yeah, I guess that draws from a variety of influences, both through fiction and media, movies, cyberpunk movies, Gattaca, The Matrix, but also through scientific concepts as well, whatever rabbit hole that I've gone down. Yes.
Do you experiment with form, or have you considered experimenting with the form of the writing to do that? because a common anxiety some writers have is that they can't be as adventurous as musicians or filmmakers or artists, or pick your artistic medium, essentially. They always feel the grass is greener using another medium of communication. And do you feel that your desire to talk about things that are ahead of the curve means you might have to write in a way that risks being too experimental, too much?
Mm-hmm. I think being quite a baby writer, I feel that I'm only starting to experiment a bit more with form. And, you know, there are ways that I want to try. So I've, you know, tried to write, I've written things that are in different forms. For example, writing a piece that was written as a manual from the future about a particular technology, or branching out a little bit into poetry as well. But I think these are baby steps, and I think they probably come with a bit of confidence in my own voice as well, and acknowledging that yes, I can approach these things from different angles.
Yeah, I think naturally. Oh, sorry. I was gonna say something. I think naturally, what I love about your work, Grace, is that you incorporate that sort of medical and scientific language anyway, and the way you describe things is so refreshing just by the way that you use that scientific language. Like, I think that it kind of naturally comes into your work when you're sort of like, you have two sort of passions, or you have two things that you constantly think about. And I think that's what's really special about your work, is that when you read your work and you use this sort of like, almost like, and I guess this feeds into genre again, is like you kind of make the body alien. And that's what I like to do with my work as well. It's kind of like, I like to make the world alien. But when I read your work, you like making the body alien to, like, you know, the human body alien to the human, which is something that I think is really, it's really interesting to like analyze. And I think you already kind of do play with form in that way, if that makes sense.
Oh, thank you. I think that is something that maybe we both explore a bit in our work, sort of. I feel like that relationship and disconnect from the physical body and the loss of the disconnection from the physical experience and the physical body because of various reasons.
I think that's like something that fiction like has the upper hand in exploring, because even though like we can visually sort of see that happen in film, I think when you talk about the mind, when you were talking about the mind before, Grace, that's something that we can do with fiction really well. And that's where fiction still serves a purpose, is sort of like asking that question, like sort of how can we redesign perspective of ourselves and like our society using fiction, because we become sort of the main character or the narrative, like the narrator in the story. So it's like, how do we alienate ourselves from our body in order to have a moment outside of our existence to redesign our society and like revolutionize by decentering ourselves? And that's where it's super important to talk about like mental health in fiction, or like mental like mindfulness, or like our perceptions of our own bodies in fiction. And I think that's something that you really do in your fiction. Yeah.
I see it in both of your writing. Jamie, in yours, it's interesting. The protagonist of Gunk Baby is, we've actually talked about this one-on-one, and you talk about reflecting. She's someone who fits in with the geometries of other people, where she lives. And Grace, as Jamie said, you take this sort of horror trope about the idea of someone not being who they are, or an empty vessel, and you really anchor it in a way that feels more ominous, because it is approached in such a nonchalant, realistic way. You don't try to add this melodramatic layer that isn't necessary. The horror is because it is so mundane. I actually wanted to bring up one thing I really liked in a story that uses that trope. I think it's of Hunger and Fury. Grace, is that right? Yeah. So in this story, well, we can't say for sure about the narrator, except they have some sort of Chinese background. And they've traveled to, I'm not sure if it's Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Yep.
Malaysia, yeah.
And they go there with their boyfriend, who it seems has an Irish background or is non-Chinese background. And at one point, one of the great jokes in this story is there's a nurse who says the name Kavanagh and expects to see someone who doesn't look like the narrator being of Asian appearance. I mean, I really like this, but tell me about these anchorings in the story, because I think they're very clever. This idea where you're taking the trope of people not being themselves, being out of body, and using it to discuss things that are very real in terms of race.
Yeah. Ooh, that's a tricky question. I think maybe that comes a little bit from that feeling of wanting to play with people's expectations. And I think in a couple of these horror works that I've written, which weren't actually, I didn't know I was writing horror when I wrote them, but they turned out to be horror. But I think I really wanted to present like the interiority of these characters who had these very dreadful, horrific experiences in many ways, but from the outside, there's a real mundanity to it as well. So it was, a lot of the horror was internal, that what they were experiencing was very horrific, but in some ways they didn't realize it, and often, you know, many of the people around them didn't realize that their experience was horrific. So there's that sort of, things are not what they seem. The interior experience of someone can be quite powerful and hidden away under the surface of, you know, regular everyday society. And I think that's a really quite a powerful thing about writing horror, where you can sort of, I think there was this idea of sort of making the monsters in your head into actual monsters on the page. And that, I think that was sort of what I was trying to present in those, in Of Hunger and Fury and in The Mark. Yeah, I think there was this, I was reading your review, Declan, of a couple of books that had addressed domestic violence in marginalized communities, and that idea of the horror being in the dream house, not being a dream, but being the horror is that the dream house is real. So yeah, I think that was really elegantly said, the way you put it there.
Well, that's Carmen Maria Machado, her memoir, In the Dream House, which really impressed me, because it is about that idea that you're already in the dream house. And part of I mean, when I was growing up, I loved The Twilight Zone, I loved Edgar Allan Poe, and I liked these narratives because they kind of told you that you were already in hell. Like, it's not going to happen later on. The horror isn't coming for you, it's already there. And that is the scary thing. I think, again, the difference between genre and literature, if we take literature to be something that speaks to us as being true, and genre is something that seems false for the sake of an argument, genre is something that tells you a lie, in terms of, it reads as false because it makes things more melodramatic than they need to be, as opposed to literature being something true. It says, no, things are already horrible. Like, there's racism, there's apocalyptic dangers all the time, there's trauma, there's abuse. You don't need to imagine boogeymen when the world is full of them already.
At the same time, though, I think you can also play into many of those tropes of genre and use the expectations of genre and then kind of expand on them, or extrapolate from them to convey really interesting ideas as well. What am I trying to say? Yes. Sort of.
No, go on, because I was going to say, actually, in the past, I feel that 19th century and pre-19th century, there was a lot more fantastical imagining, a lot more creativity in literature. People allowed there to be more of the fantastical or the occult or the unusual in everyday stories across cultures. Yeah.
I mean, for me, one of the things that I love to do in short fiction, and I have really, I've really grown to love writing short fiction. I find it so powerful and fun. And one of the things that I like to do is kind of play with alternative futures or alternative societies and kind of use them sometimes to either break free from some of the social norms or the assumptions that we are somewhat constrained by in the present day. So, presenting an alternative future that explores gender and sexuality and breaks free from some of those norms, or on the other hand, extrapolating from some of the things that we see in society today and presenting it coming at it in a parallel way. So, crafting an alien society where inequality is presented in a different way. Like, it's maybe my way of not being able to say things front on, but coming at it from a sideways angle is, I haven't always done it in the most elegant way, but it's something that I really enjoy about playing into those genre tropes and
totally. Maybe the speculative fictions were the ones we picked up along the way. No, totally. I think that in Jamie and your work too, there is this lateral way that you're talking about ethnicity or class through pop culture or through capitalism. Does that feel more true to you than spelling it out?
Yeah, I think because the idea that when you are oppressed or marginalized from society, you are kind of, and this is where it's really interesting what you guys are just speaking about, is that when you are oppressed or marginalized from society, you are the alien. And so when I would read books, I automatically made myself the alien, but I found this hyper empathy, especially when the writer was writing something against you or using a stereotype against you. So if an Asian character would come up in a book, for example, or a woman character would come up in a book, it would directly try to push me out. But then I feel you develop this sort of powering through a book that has interruptions of that makes you sort of this extraterrestrial, hyper empathetic. I feel it gave me this power to be able to try to get into the mind of this sort of racist person, but racism was just another part of their way of living. And so I feel when I write books now, I'm really interested in the idea of making the reader alien regardless. So that's why I feel there's so much work, obviously, in the places that I come from. So in Australia and Hong Kong, they're both settled colonial societies, and there's so much to unpack just in that. But for me, these first two books, I was super interested in writing about that experience of being an alien to just this very sort of specific area of society, and that was hyper-consumerism and suburbia and gated communities. Those two I wanted to make a planet. So I feel when I write books, especially in a nowhere place, I create a planet where I can have a hyper focus on those things, because it helps me sort of process the dynamics and the margins that are created with the social perspective of each character is what makes it, rather than sort of this black or white way. It's kind of I don't like to write about good and evil either. I feel that's also becoming something that writers are discarding, because it's kind of you want to explore the blurred line rather than either side, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You want a book where everyone is already cancelled. You want a book where everyone is
exactly. Yeah.
You've all been cancelled. Wake up. And no, we've discussed this because I do feel it's so tiring to hear these some of the own voices in cancel culture conversations. I just feel it's talking about something that doesn't speak to the actual experience of the reader or the writer. And I agree with you that I think what we look for in art and when we're writing is the experience of being alienated from everything.
Yeah.
And it's a much more exploratory process. The way it's framed is closer to a kind of politics or, a false narrative, I think, that suits journalism, but isn't the experience of the writer or the reader. And I think it's actually really novel that you would make everyone an alien in your work, so that there is no kind of normative protagonist.
Because like I sort of grew up very excluded from all areas of my life, I think I always spent an idea of thinking what was normal. Even one time when I was in an interview, someone called me non-mainstream as a way to like call me a woman of color, I guess. And like they, it confuses me. And I think that like these two books, especially for me, kind of like what we were talking about before, was like how I could process how I interact with society. And then I feel like, reading has always made me alien from the book, but it's also included me the most, if that makes sense. That sounds like really sad, but like, do you guys know what I mean? I hope you know what I mean.
I'm curious, actually, are there any books either of you have read where you identify with a protagonist who people would not expect you to, in terms of being, non-mainstream, to use that wacky term? Or, have there ever been times when you've identified with someone that would be unexpected?
I think Jack Kerouac.
Yeah.
Nice.
Like the most like whack sort of,
I love identifying like a bit like what you were saying, Jamie, with the alien or the monster in the story, which I think is very unexpected, an unexpected character for me to identify with on the surface. But yes, I think that particularly in horror, and particularly reflecting that experience of growing up often being seen as the other and needing to kind of squeeze myself into what others expected, what society expected, that feeling of alienation or otherness in writing can be something that can be cathartic to identify with. And I don't know why, but we've been talking about Carmen Maria Machado, and I mentioned that the short story The Resident was one that really lingered with me. And there was a particular outsider kind of nature to the protagonist's voice, and that feeling of everything being creepy and slightly surreal and not quite belonging. And for some reason that was one that really stuck with me.
What about Jack Kerouac? Jack Kerouac. Did you love?
Oh no, it's not that I loved it. It's just that like I feel like it's one of those times where I powered through. I don't know. I'm such a voyeur, and I've always been quite like a bit self-sabotaging sometimes. And so I think for the power to sort of like feel like I want to explore why I don't belong, I read books where I literally will not in the eyes of the author. So in a sense, it's a bit voyeuristic. It's not necessarily that I, related to everything he said, obviously. But it's just the feeling of being close to something that isn't what you'd expect, as Grace said. So I guess like I never really finished books either. So I used to do that in the library a lot, where I'd sort of read a lot of like unexpected works, and like I felt like sort of really powerful that I got to be the consumer, and I got to be sort of the person in the center deciding how I'd approach the world that the author presented. And that's what I like about my book, because my book doesn't also sort of highlight anything about the way characters look, the way that Jack Kerouac does. And I think there's like a power to the reader deciding how they look based on their analysis of the way they're reacted to. So the reader would read that, someone was a bit snarky, or like someone did like a slight thing with their face. And I think that's where details, like hyper details, are really relevant in my book, is that I want the reader to be like, oh, this person must be this because of the way that they're reacting to this. But then there are so many contradictions in the way Lean acts as an Asian woman. And I want the reader to pick that up. I don't want them to think that Lean is a lifeless character, because she is a bit of like a, she is really blunt a lot of the time. Spoiler alert. I don't know if that's a spoiler alert, but I want the reader to be like, this must be why, rather than being like, Lean felt this way because of this. And that's sort of like a direct parallel to not talking about ethnicity or not talking about place.
I noticed that now that you mention it, I do notice how you do that. What was that term you used? You zoom in on a particular aspect of a character's movement or their embodied feeling, and you use super unique turns of phrase to convey that, to put the reader into that person's body in such an unexpected way in Gunk Baby.
Yeah,
really cool.
Thank you.
And yeah, I felt like Lean was such a fascinating character because she didn't act in ways that you at first might expect her to act. Yeah. And there was such a sense of growing, I guess, alienation. And like, I thought it was really interesting how she had this cultural, her family background, her mother's practices, and so she was kind of bringing that into her everyday work. But at the same time, I felt like there was such a distance between her and her mother as well, that she communicated with her mother at times. But
no way, that's crazy that you picked up on that.
Okay, yeah, because the mother
really
almost
not close to mum.
Sorry, too much. Sorry.
No.
Yeah,
I want to hear Jamie. Go on.
It almost felt like
about your relationship with her
hallucinatory.
mother.
Like some of those things weren't real, and then you had this hyper focus on the societal bubble that she was in. It was, really interesting.
I think because often we are caught in those like sort of obsessions, right? Or we talk about phases. I don't think any character is ever a stagnant character, and I don't think any person is ever a stagnant person. Like, I sort of feel like I didn't associate it all with my body until I was 19 when I wrote Pink Mountain, actually. And like, it's really interesting to me to be able to write from the first person point of view, completely aware that or not even completely, like the character wouldn't be completely aware that they're disembodied from themselves, or that they struggle from like body dysmorphia, or that they don't know how to perceive themselves except for in the eyes of the oppressor. And I find that a really interesting thing to write. And I hope that comes across in this book, but it's definitely something that I've been striving to write for a long time, and I want to write that well. That's like something that I'm really interested in. It's really interesting that you sort of picked up on the idea of the distant relationships versus the close relationships, because I think a lot of people would have different perspectives of how she feels about each of the characters. Yeah.
I think one of the sorry, you go, Declan.
No, you go.
I feel like one of the big things that there was this sense of like, how do you assert yourself, or how does one assert themselves when you're also coming to terms with like the big uncontrollable forces that have shaped your existence and are continuing to shape your existence. And I feel like that's a theme that is at the core of a lot of what I write as well. So interesting.
Yeah, so good.
Especially hard when there's a cult, that inhabits Muji sort of shopping center. I hate trying to figure things out. There's a cult involved. Also a spoiler. No, I'm also very confused because we have 1 minute left, but this is all online. So I'm not sure if we're allowed, in real life, we can kind of like blow it out and say 5 more minutes, 10 more minutes, everyone's screaming encore. But in this case, if anyone has questions in the audience, feel free to ask them. I genuinely don't even know if we're just going to get cut or we just keep going. 5 minutes is okay. So we'll go until 5 past, and feel free if anyone in the audience has questions, just type them away. We will see them. But among all that, I think there was so much to talk about. Does anyone have anything they wanted to raise that hasn't been brought up? Anything that interests them about this question of form characterization. Give you a minute. I will step in if you don't have something. All right, I'm going to step in. I got too caught up.
I think it's time to play the intermission music.
No, I think there's so many interesting things came up. I do see links between. Again, I thought Grace was very clever. The way that you laterally come at ethnicity in that short story, and I think that's so common to experience. Whenever I traveled, I would always go to the part that didn't represent the norm. So, for example, in France, I would want to go to a Middle Eastern community or eat noodles or do things you weren't meant to do. Like everyone would complain, why aren't you eating camembert? Why aren't you, doing stereotypical things, seeing the Eiffel Tower? And it just didn't interest me. I just thought there was more truth in what was marginalized. I actually felt that the normative image was a false image, that I was more at home in France with communities that were minorities or not considered normative. I think that comes through strongly in your work. You too, Jamie.
Yeah, no, I was just about to say, I feel like the way that Grace reclaims Asian identity in SF and spec is really cool, because I like the idea that you've created this nostalgic sort of very warmness about when they're sitting down and eating, or when they're sort of even just together, the way that they communicate, because that's sort of reclaiming that techno-orientalism that's created, and the sort of primitivity that is put into exotification. So I really love how you do that, and that's almost kind of like a text, kind of similar, parallels what Declan was just saying about doing what's not expected, because what's expected is marketed, because how could it be expected if it wasn't? So it's kind of doing the anti is, doing the actual work to see how a society really is, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Jamie about that scene where they sit down to eat, and of course the non-Asian boyfriend is disgusted by the food, obviously.
Yes.
It's so homely. No, it's like he's the one who's wrong. This is homely. This is not. Yeah. But I guess you could also play it and say that it's a moment of horror for him, and you can see it from either perspective. It's not didactic. It doesn't say you have to identify with either perspective. It just presents them both.
Yeah, I feel like we just naturally write from the perspective of the edges or the fringe or the marginalized voices, but it's not to us. It's our world. It's sort of, it's how we see things, and to present that as the central perspective in itself is quite powerful, I think.
It is powerful, and I think all artists do it. Even if they are straight white male, a good artist will be presenting something that is different. They will hopefully be reflective and thoughtful enough to show you something otherwise, and that is how people from different cultures can identify with people who don't represent their identity. It is something not easily bounded.
Yeah.
Like Jamie and Jack Kerouac. No, but I think that's good. It's good because that isn't the conversation we hear, but that's totally what people experience. Of course, people identify with writing, and they also can disagree with the presentation of writing that is marketed as if it was for them. I think it's a good way to escape the marketing. So
Jack Kerouac did he do automatic writing as well, or something that was really stream of consciousness?
Yeah, probably. Probably.
William Burroughs did.
It's funny because I feel like I'm much more attracted to the the style of, I guess, like if we're talking about like white literature, like really like praised sort of like exclusive literature, is kind of like, yeah, they do get to have that freedom to automatic write, or they do get to have that sort of and I used it as like a form of therapy as well, which I find really interesting, is like reappropriating the genre of like literary fiction and using that practice as a process. So like when I sort of thought about automatic writing for the first time, I was like, oh, this is going to produce the best work ever. I was more like, this is going to help me process my traumas, and this is going to help me process what I want to think about, because everything's so cloudy. So it's kind of like reappropriating genre, not even just in the way it's presented, but in the way that it can be written, I guess. Yeah.
All right.
That's great.
Any final thoughts? Forget genre. That is my final thought. All right. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure having you, Jamie, Grace. Grace, good luck with the forthcoming novel, 2022.
Yeah, early next year. Yeah.
So exciting.
Yeah.
And the fiction that's been published is really great. I love it. I'm sure Jamie loves it. And Jamie, congratulations on Young Baby. Looking forward to the musical project and/or novel.
Speculative novel, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so excited for that.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you so much. It was really nice to chat. Thanks, everyone, for watching.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.